You're listening to Autumn on the Air, the weekly podcast that brings you conversations about the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Join us for interviews with patent and licensing professionals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and tech transfer leaders on the issues and trends that matter most. Keep listening for an inside track on the people, IP policies, and politics changing our world.
Today, we're talking about the year of open science and the implications of this movement on patent, licensing, and technology transfer strategies. With recent mandates from federal agencies and a growing emphasis on transparency and collaboration, the landscape of scientific research and innovation is undergoing a profound transformation. Today, we're joined by Meghan Hayes, Associate Director of Business Development and Licensing at Carnegie Mellon University, and Andrew Wichmann, Senior Intellectual Property and Licensing Manager, Digital Technology at Johns Hopkins Technology Ventures, also known as JHTV. Meghan plays a pivotal role in protecting and disseminating intellectual property arising from university research. Andrew is involved in patent strategy, open source strategy, technology transactions, and portfolio management at JHTV. Welcome, Meghan and Andrew. I'm so excited to have you here on the podcast.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa. Good to see you.
Yeah, great to see the two of you as well. And we have a lot to talk about today. So let's go ahead and kick it off. So I thought in terms of starting this conversation off today, could you give us an overview of what the year of open science entailed and how it's impacting the landscape of scientific research and innovation?
Do you want to go first, Meghan?
Sure. So the White House deemed 2023 the year of open science. It had a headline of ensuring free, immediate, and equitable access to federally funded research. So they issued a memo to federal agencies to update their public access policies to make publications and their supporting data resulting from federally funded research publicly accessible without an embargo on the free and public release. So I think, a consequence of that, obviously, it's a push towards accelerated publication of manuscripts, data, and now source code as well. So universities now have open science requirements in federal awards.
Yeah, and if you look at the memo, it seems like a lot of the motivation for this came out of the COVID-19 experience. So the rapid pace we were able to develop therapies and vaccines related to COVID-19, a lot of people credit the free sharing of information, the special rules that universities put in place to share research data and results. And so I think that's among other reasons, one of the big reasons for this new push towards.
Yeah, it really was incredible during the pandemic, the sharing of resources. And like you said, Andrew, it did lead to the rapid development of a lot of different things from diagnostic tests to new treatments. So I'm curious, with these new requirements for distributing source code that you mentioned under this open source licensing, how do you see it influencing the patent strategies within tech transfer offices?
I think it should be a significant factor in that decision-making and strategy process. We all know this, patents are a right to exclude. So their offense, an offense that takes significant resources like money and time to build. So, if exclusionary rights of a patent makes sense in a situation, that's great. But if an institution is providing code openly and freely, that practices, that method of a patent, right? And at the same time also is seeking an exclusionary right, that's hard to reconcile generally, and then let alone spend money on. Right? We all have budget constraints and we all have to make informed decisions when we're thinking about patent protection. So it has to make sense. And I'm not sure generally it makes sense. But that's not to say there aren't strategies that could work. I think this is going to push us in our roles to make deeper dives in these assessments, to come up with more nuanced strategies and really have an understanding of what the code actually does, if it's provided openly. And to think about that in respect to if there's another protectable subject invention coming out of that same research project. And then thinking about those on a deeper dive and what's worth protecting and what makes more sense to provide openly or that we have to provide openly.
I would just add, I already forgot to do this, but just to be clear, I'm speaking for myself and not for the Johns Hopkins University. But it depends on the subject matter, I think, clearly. So a lot of university tech transfer focuses on the biotech industry and compounds and therapeutic approaches and life sciences innovations, which aren't going to have the same type of aren't going to be impacted in the same way as more of the computational side of the world, which I think myself and Meghan focus a lot on. It also depends on the details. So the memo and the steps that the agencies have taken to implement that memo over the last year, it puts a lot of discretion in the hands of the agencies themselves about how they go about requiring open access. So at base, it's in some senses it's nothing too new. You're going to have publications of manuscripts maybe a little bit faster than they used to be, and you're going to have more data published a little bit faster than it used to, or maybe when it wasn't in previous cases, and you're going to have source code coming with those publications. This just sort of standardizes that requirement among the funding agencies, and then leaves those agencies the opportunity to decide what type of use rights, what type of rights need to come with those publications. So there's issues for patents in the sense of we're always concerned about public disclosures impacting patentability and the areas where you can obtain patent rights. But then there's also, when you start talking about source code, you need some sort of license rights to that source code to be able to replicate the findings of a manuscript or validate whatever is being claimed about that source code. So there's some sort of license comes with that code in order to do the basic work of validating scientific research. And the devil is in the details of what those licenses say. And so you'll see some agencies are pretty forthright about their expectation on having very permissive open source licenses accompany those publications. So from what I've looked at, NASA is leading the way on this side of things. You have other agencies like NIH being pretty clear that source code is part of the data that's disclosed, but not as forthright on what type of license will accompany that. They basically leave it on a case by case basis with the given funder within NIH for that research. So, it's still going to require looking at the requirements for your agreement. The same way, you've always been looking at sponsored research agreements when trying to assess the impact on intellectual property. But it just seems like there's going to be a lot more of a push towards agencies being explicit about how and when and under what conditions this information is shared.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's going to be a challenge keeping what each agency is going to require straight for people in tech transfer offices such as yourselves. It sounds like there's not a one-size-fit-all policy, like you were saying, Andrew, and NASA has one approach versus NIH. So I think keeping all that information, like I said, straight is going to be a challenge going forward. So I'm curious, walk us through a little bit about how these changes intersect with traditional research terms and conditions, like with the Bayh-Dole provisions.
Yeah, as we all know, Bayh-Dole addresses subject inventions. In my opinion, I think it's suspiciously silent on copyrights. And it's something that we've thought a lot about at my institution. Our researchers produce a lot of software out of federal awards and have for a very long time. And it's not that, even historically, it hasn't always made sense to file patent applications associated methods and systems that come out of this research when we do have software out of it. So in a way, there's sort of a reporting issue that can pop up. Like, how do we report this? Are we still getting, quote unquote, credit for this research output when, the structure we all know by Bayh-Dole, Edison is really focused on subject inventions and patenting. Not to take it back to the previous question, to focus on patents, but that's our biggest framework from the government at this point. So in my opinion, I think there's a gap between, this directive and the traditional sort of Bayh-Dole. I also think that there could potentially be a tension between these open science requirements and the preferences for US-based manufacturing that we're getting from these same agencies. So it's something that we're going to have to work through and see how they play together.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that other than a lot of Bayh-Dole has compliance requirements that trigger on publication, and so if we're going to have a lot more publication and public access, then there's going to be more dates to track and manage. A question I've had in my mind is in those circumstances where you're working in a computational area that has a lot of source code. If you're under an agency grant that, let's just say, is requiring a strong permissive license that's clear, it's giving patent rights as part of that open source license, and for whatever reason you also happen to patent that an implementation of that code, does that non-exclusive open source license have implications for Bayh-Dole compliance, as far as tracking commercial activity or what is happening with that code? Because it is granting, a patent license to a subject invention. And I think the normal reading of how Bayh-Dole works, I've never heard an answer to this question. Maybe someone smarter than me has figured this all out and it's not a problem, but it's just something that I've been curious about.
Yeah, that is a really great question. I've never seen that answer either. So you both have mentioned this significant shift towards transparency and collaboration. How do you think this openness affects the balance between protecting IP as well as fostering innovation?
Yeah, first, I think it should be acknowledged that, our society has established IP protections for the purpose of fostering innovation in the first place. So, for both open science and our existing system of protecting intellectual property, the end game is the same, right? It's about driving and fostering innovation. And I think that can be true. I don't think it's at odds with each other. As we've mentioned before, right, our industry is all about details, and there's no one proper strategy for dissemination. It's technology and intent and market and culture dependent, depending on the situation. So I think they can go hand in hand.
Yeah, I would add, our offices are generally set up to disseminate knowledge and translate the benefits of research for society. Nothing in those mission statements says it needs to be done through patents or proprietary rights. So the end game is promoting innovation one way or another. And I think a lot of these open science requirements are just recognizing that Bayh-Dole was really and is really important legislation for a sector of innovation, and open science practices are a good framework for innovation in another sector of science. And just deciding what falls where, is just another tool for overall promoting the progress of science and benefits to society.
Now, the two of you are obviously deeply involved in business development and licensing. So I'm curious, how have you seen these changes manifest in what you do from day in and day out?
Yeah, first and foremost, I'm certainly fielding more questions and having discussions around open science, open source, these sort of requirements that we're seeing, and federal awards, honestly, also some industry sponsored awards and journals as well. So there's a lot of chatter out there on open science and open source. So I'm having more of those discussions, weekly at this point with researchers. And then, also I'll admit at this point, we are seeing a slight impact on IP disclosure numbers in that, we're not receiving as many as we'd expect on projects of certain sizes. So I think there is going to be an effect for sure on that side of things. But, I think that is addressable, at least in increasing our educational outreach to our researchers on the subject and on our campuses, right? I think we should be informing ourselves of what these requirements are, what the current climate is on this, and then, reinforcing that we are a resource as a tech transfer office for our researchers to address intellectual property and licensing and dissemination issues. So again, to Andrew's previous point, there's no one way to do that. And that doesn't mean, a hardcore technology license. It can also be just discussing open source, which I think I'm seeing an increase in.
I think I see it in at least two areas. One is, and they may not be necessarily the result of, open science practices as much as just the rise of open source in general as fundamental to software development in general. So for someone who works, pretty exclusively in digital technology, the amount of diligence that can be brought upon a project that is mature and been built over many years using open source components, when it comes to trying to license that to someone else or to in whatever format of license, just the amount of open source tools and packages and libraries that are out there to use has made progress of research in computational areas really fast. I mean, you look at how quickly AI is maturing. Largely, the entire AI industry was the first, generations before OpenAI and these private models. It was all open source research, and that just has accelerated tremendously. But it has made, like, when you get a code base to try to license to someone, making sure that code base is internally coherent among the licenses it's using, and then will fit the licensing strategy of the outside company, just raises the complexity in those types of deals, as well as how the open source licenses might impact or not impact other intellectual property rights you have in that project. The other area, I think, is more of an opportunity, which is that as open source software has grown, so have the prevalence and feasibility of open source businesses. So, there's a whole lucrative sector now in commercial open source software, which is a commercializing company building a commercial product on an open source project. I think that's an opportunity for tech transfer offices to think about commercialization in a slightly different way, or put more emphasis on open source commercial opportunities when they arise. So those are at least two ways. They're related to the general open science practices, but I think more so it's just the purposes behind open science are complementary to just the general industry of software development and its push towards open source software overall.
Now, given how quickly things are moving in open science and the experience that both of you have in intellectual property law and academia, how do you navigate the intricacies of this evolving landscape, especially concerning patent and licensing strategies?
Yeah, it's certainly another factor to consider. And we've said it multiple times now, but we're a details type industry. And so it's another detail to be mindful of. But I also, from my point of view, I think it's an opportunity to force us to be more creative in how we think about commercialization strategies. Again, it might not be our tried and true IP licenses, but we might have to think about, what about training and accreditations and certifications in certain types of open source software? We've mentioned this, but there's always going to be complementary assets to anything that's out there. So we can develop those as well. And then there's already a lot of examples, and I'll admit, I think other offices have, done deeper dives into dual licensing models and really thinking about strategy. But again, that's what we do in our roles, right? We're strategic and we're detail oriented. So in a way, it's just another factor.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just increased the complexity when you're dealing with software. So, I think there's a general rule of thumb that if research is based in an open source license, tech transfer offices are not as interested in it, or are not it's not going to be at the top of the list of things they're spending time on. I think that's, if someone holds that belief, I think that's not the greatest way of thinking about it, in a sense, just because, I think most research that is involving software is going to be open source in some form or fashion. Like dealing with, research that is based in source code is going to be dealing with open source licenses. And so it's kind of going to come with the territory, whether, you want to give it energy or not. And so then the question is, how do you deal with it? And, it's created opportunities, like Meghan was mentioning. And I think, for tech transfer offices to think about what it means to translate technology and what it means to translate technology in a commercial manner versus other manners, and their role in that space. I also think, like, even in traditional kind of patent licensing focused tech transfer, it doesn't, just because there's open source code connected to that patent, or that is, a implementation of one approach that, research has shown to be beneficial, doesn't mean that patent is then worthless. And so thinking carefully about what the open source code is doing versus what the patented implementation is doing and what the ultimate product will be is just a little bit more thinking around the strategy and IP and these types of technologies.
Yeah, and that actually leads me to ask, given all that's going on with respect to these open science initiatives, have you encountered any misconceptions or misunderstandings regarding these initiatives, and what have those implications been for tech transfer offices?
I think that, some people think this is a new concept or that it's going to end technology transfer as we know it. But open source software, is well established. It's a whole culture at this point. And, we've had, the Department of Education has had open science type obligations for 20 years now. We're still here. And yeah, it's not as new, I think, as people are fearing it is.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to that, other than it might seem new just because there's just a lot more software in the world than there used to be. But, I think the general concerns, go back decades at this point, and, we're just dealing with them more frequently now.
Yeah, and another question I have kind of related to that is, every TTO is looking at measuring metrics. So how do you measure metrics in this area, in this context of an open environment?
Yeah, I think is the new area.
Yeah,
to be honest, is the metrics. And I do think the metrics that TTOs are, measuring and measured on are going to have to evolve or adjust to capture these types of translations, this type of dissemination that we're seeing now. We've seen it for a long time, but the volume is increased now. So maybe we were fine sort of losing some of the metrics before. I don't think we should be anymore. The problem is that we don't have an easy way to track those yet. We can think about ways, maybe there will be an iEdison reporting for such open source software or open data, right? Maybe there will be a way where we can report what has been provided on an open platform to the government. We don't have any good ways of tracking, GitHub downloads or anything like that at this point. Sometimes you could work with your communications team to highlight good stories, like the impact of a project, get some good press out of an open situation. But I think there will be, we need to remind folks that tech transfer is about the spread of information and knowledge and the benefit to the public that it brings. And that doesn't fit necessarily neatly into, a number of startups or reporting license revenue for a year. So I think we will, that's going to be the challenge here.
Yeah, it reminds me of something I just heard, and I'm going to get the number wrong, but someone actually did a study to try to quantify the global value of open source software, and it was some unimaginable calculation, amount of money. It was
it must be
GDP
huge.
of the US of for over a year or something like that. It was colossal. So there's an undeniable benefit being translated through open source releases and open source communities. How tech transfer offices relate to that is an open question. I echo Megan's comments about it's hard to get your arms around it. Faculty do lots of different things, and we don't see all of them or have access to all of them. And maybe we shouldn't in a lot of cases. I don't know, but it is not just an issue for academia. I mean, IBM, interestingly enough, over the last year has started introducing similar to their historically IBM filed all the patents. They were the number one filer in the US for years and years and years and years and years, and they no longer are. And they've adjusted their employee incentive plans to reduce some of the values, values set upon patent filing, and instead increase rewards that go to open source contributions of significant value. And I think that's if that is something that a company like IBM is doing, which is the sort of poster child for patenting in America for decades and decades, I think it's something that universities might think about as far as placing importance on significant open source contributions. One other thing I'll add to this, just because I'm always reminded of it, we had a discussion about this during our talk at Autumn. Chris Gear at the University of Minnesota once suggested this to me, and I think it's a smart way of thinking about it, which is that Autumn requires us to track material transfer agreements. So every year we report how many material transfer agreements, and these are agreements that they sound like they transfer material. And source code is material in that sort of sense. I mean, it's not material in a tangible thing, but it's the same idea. And far more source code gets transferred from universities through open source licenses than paper, material transfer transactions. So, if we're going to count material transfer agreements and think of that as transferring technology, which they are, I think it only stands to reason that open source licenses and open source transactions be treated the same way.
Yeah, I agree with you. That makes a lot of sense. And I wanted to ask the two of you, for your respective institutions, Carnegie Mellon and Johns Hopkins, what are some of the proactive steps that you've taken to adapt to some of these changes and ensure that you remain at the forefront of innovation while also complying with these new requirements?
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, open source software is not new to CMU. It's something we've been working with and innovating in for a long time now. So it doesn't feel, these new requirements don't feel that new here. It's a part of our culture, and we see it as a tech transfer win already. Not saying that we have a good way of defining it or keeping track of it with a metric, but we already see it in a positive light, and that it's part of tech transfer. So that's, I would say where we're one step ahead, maybe of some other offices. But outside of our office now, so we have an open source programs office on campus in OSPO. That's tasked with raising awareness and education and capacity for open source software, and managing it and, providing resources on it. So I would say the university is interested in it and, looking to see how, we can have an even better environment for this open science, and be a leader in it. It's very new, so we're still working it all out.
Yeah, I would, to add on to that, and probably one of the reasons that Meghan and I organized this panel at Autumn this year is the person that started and runs Carnegie Mellon's open source programs office is Saeed Chowdhury, who started and founded the open source programs office at Johns Hopkins University before he went to Carnegie Mellon.
There's the connection.
and this was, I don't know, it was right when I started, so it must have been about 4 years ago. And that was the first open source programs office that's ever been opened at a university. It was at Johns Hopkins University. For those who don't know, an open source programs office is it's what it sounds like. It's an organization. It's an office within an organization that organizes the intake and output of open source software to and from that organization. So setting policies, advising constituent parts of that organization. Just making decisions on, integration of open source projects into that organization's, software infrastructure. They've been around for decades in the tech sector. I think the first one was started sometime in the 90s, I believe at Sun Microsystems, and now they're starting to spread to universities. So there's roughly a dozen of them in the U.S. Most of these are funded by the Sloan Foundation. But you see them in government now too. I believe I'm blanking on the name of the federal agency. Had just recently opened the first open source programs office in a federal agency. But they're organizations set up to help an institution or company or whatever responsibly handle the open source software that they're interacting with. And so we, much like Carnegie Mellon, it sounds like, are trying to figure out how tech transfer offices work with these offices, because we kind of have two sides of the same coin. These offices are spending a lot of time on our campus trying to help faculty just build reusable, deployable, trustworthy research artifacts, scientific software that other people can use and then release under open source licenses. That's pretty complementary to our mission in a lot of ways, because if you're building a good research artifact, that's a strong basis for a good commercial product somewhere down the line, as opposed to, what typically happens in universities is faculty are not interested in building a product. They're interested in proving a concept and doing research and moving on. And the same challenges with someone else taking that and replicating their work or using it for their own purposes for a research purpose. Those are similar challenges to some company taking that work and building a product out of it and trying to sell it in a sustainable way. So there's some synergies, I think, between the two approaches, and some benefit to tech transfer of these types of technologies, I think, from having open source programs office or people within your organization that are doing that job, whether you call them an open source programs office or not.
So I wanted to ask the two of you, how do you see the relationship between academic leadership and TTOs evolving in response to these shifts towards open science?
Yeah, I think we have to get on the same page of, what is technology transfer? Is it, and again, it's dissemination of the fruits of research out to benefit the public. So there's going to have to be a shift in mindset. And I think that's the role of the Technology Transfer Office, is to educate and help facilitate that shift in mindset of what is a tech transfer win, and that open science is a tech transfer win. And so it will go back to our discussion on metrics. And I think that's going to have to be a discussion that happens with leadership, of saying what's important to our university. And then let's come up with ways to track what's important to our university. But you're going to have to get on the same page.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that, other than as an example, Johns Hopkins has recently made a very, very large investment in a new institute that they're calling the Artificial Data Science and Artificial Intelligence Institute.
Original name, right?
But it's that general, I believe, because it's a cross enterprise activity. So it's going through all the university and the health system and all different areas. And along with that is a commitment to translation and interest in open practices around the outputs of that investment. And I think it's all in recognition that this is where this field is and where it is headed, even more so in the future. And that's just sort of where things are going. And so getting on the same page between TTOs and different organizations within your university and researchers in these areas is just, it's just going to have to happen,
So as the podcast comes to a close, I wanted to ask each of you, what do you envision as the future trajectory of patent licensing and tech transfer in light of this embrace of openness in scientific research?
I'll admit I'm ever the optimist. So at this point, I'm willing to take open science at face value, and that it will foster innovation, both scientific and I think how technology transfer offices find ways to license and commercialize and create impact based on that scientific innovation. So I think it's exciting. We get to think about doing things a little differently at this point, and remembering that, true tech transfer story is impact, right? And I don't think that's going away.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's another type of technology transfer that I think will just see increased formalization and, roles and job titles and responsibilities and all that kind of stuff will come along with it that openly recognizes open source translation as the job of tech transfer. And so there's skill sets and things you need to learn in order to do that. And I think that's what tech transfer offices will do, if I had to guess.
Well, Meghan and Andrew, thank you so much for spending this time with us today to talk about open science and tech transfer offices, for sharing your expertise and all your experience with us.
Thanks, Lisa. It was fun.
Thank you.
As we wrap up today's episode, I want to thank Meghan and Andrew for sharing their experience and perspectives on the evolving landscape of open science and its impact on patenting, licensing, and tech transfer. It's clear that the year of open science is reshaping the way we approach scientific research. Until next time, stay curious and keep innovating.
Thanks for listening to Autumn on the Air with Lisa Mueller. Get social with us and share your thoughts. You can tweet us at AUTM or visit us online at autm.net. We'll be back next week on the air. Be sure to join us.